That's the end, isn't it? I have not heard from him in a month. He has moved on, hasn't he? I exposed what she is like to all her family. She won't be contacting me again, that's for sure. I told him I know what he is, and he disappeared, so I doubt I'll be hearing from him again. He is with somebody else already, so I guess he won't want me again, will he? I told him what I thought of him, and he just backed off. He won't hoover me, will he? He came crying back to me, and I gave him short shrift. I doubt he will bother again. Wrong. There are many different scenarios and outcomes involving our kind, where the victim considers that our kind will not bother with them again, post-discard or post-escape. The victim thinks that a period of total silence, the involvement of the narcissist with a new victim, the manner in which the relationship ended, will all mean that the narcissist will not come sniffing around the victim ever again. We will. Why is this the case? Firstly, you must understand our perspective. You belong to us. You are our appliance. You are our property. The formal relationship between us may have ended, but the narcissistic relationship is forever. It only ends when you or I cease to draw breath. It does not matter that we enter into a new formal relationship with somebody else. It does not matter if you do. It does not matter that World War III erupted when we parted company. It does not matter if there has been complete silence for 2 years. None of those factors alter the fact that in our minds, the connection between you and I, because of the narcissistic relationship, lasts until one of us dies. Secondly, the attraction of gathering fuel from you is substantial, and this is the prime driver for never letting go. Fuel is so important to us that it drives everything about our behaviour, and the link between you and I is no exception to the all-pervasive power of fuel. Thirdly, factors such as new partners, the affliction of time, and the manner in which the formal relationship has ended are largely immaterial. I am repeatedly asked by people whether a Hoover will happen. I always answer in the same way. The risk always remains, but you can manage that risk. People set out the circumstances of the end of the formal relationship to me and what has happened since, if anything, and ask whether a Hoover will happen, or express their view that they do not think it will happen because of A, B, or C. My answer, again, is the same. The risk of us returning always remains, but you can manage that risk. It is never the end. There is always a risk, a chance, a probability, or a possibility that we will return to you and apply a Hoover. You cannot assume that it is over. No matter how much it may seem that it is over, no matter how much it may appear to you that we will not come back, that we apparently have no reason to do so, such assumptions are dangerous. There are only 2 factors which are material to the issue of whether you will be hoovered again. The first factor is the Hoover Trigger. For a Hoover to happen, potentially, it must be triggered. This means you must come into our sights, that we sniff the prospective fuel that leaks from you, that something happens to cause you to come up on our radar. Whether this happens depends on whether you enter one of the 6 spheres of influence. I will be detailing what those 6 spheres of influence are to a greater extent, but for the purposes of this recording, it is safe to say that the 6 spheres of influence are where you might contact us, we may contact you, we see you crossing the street, a friend mentions us to us, or you just pop up in our mind. Essentially, you have control over whether you enter any of the first 5 spheres of influence. So that is if you contact us, go to somewhere where we might be, etc. And you have no control over whether you enter the 6th sphere of influence. The 6th sphere of influence is when you just happen to pop into our minds. Sometimes this happens because we see something that reminds you of us, and on other occasions it simply just happens. By staying away from us through no contact, you will not enter the first 5 spheres of influence. Thus, if you have successfully implemented no contact, the only risk of a Hoover trigger being activated is if we happen to think of you. You, however, cannot influence that. Our preoccupation with your replacement following your discard means we are far less likely to think of you. And accordingly, Hoovers are more likely to be triggered by you doing something to enter the first 5 spheres, such as messaging us or passing where we live. If you maintain no contact, the first 5 spheres will not be entered. It then just depends on whether we happen to think of you. This may not happen for weeks, months, possibly even years. You can therefore see that by staying out of the first 5 spheres, you will vastly reduce the risk of a Hoover trigger being activated, but you cannot state that it will never happen, as it is reliant on if we happen to think of you. That may just be a random occurrence, or it might be because we see something that reminds us of you. Thus, if there is a Hoover trigger, then the second factor that is applicable, once this Hoover trigger has been activated, is whether the Hoover execution criteria have been met. The Hoover execution criteria includes such matters as whether you are a potent source of fuel, whether you can easily be located, whether you can easily be contacted, whether you have your defences maintained concerning us, whether you remain mired in the emotional sea, what support networks that you have in place, how well fueled we might be, the nature of the narcissist that you have entangled with, whether it is a lesser, mid-range or greater, and potential Hoover hurdles. All of these matters combine to determine whether it is worthwhile us expending our energy to act on the Hoover trigger. If we are presented with a sitting target, flowing with fuel, caught in the emotional sea, isolated and exposed, then the Hoover execution criteria bar is low, and therefore a Hoover will take place. If, on the other hand, it is very hard to contact you, we know that you have stopped flowing with fuel when dealing with us, you have people who will stop us trying to reach you and so forth, you become what is known as a flawed reason to extract emotion, also known as a free. I will be detailing a worked example of what happens if somebody enters the sphere of influence and the considerations that apply as to whether a Hoover execution criteria is met, and therefore a Hoover will occur, in a separate recording. Accordingly, if you can do everything possible to become a free, then even if there is a Hoover trigger which is activated, then the chances of us executing that Hoover will be considerably reduced. By contrast, if you fail to attain becoming a free, then you run the risk of a Hoover being executed. You will note that in the Hoover execution criteria above, there is no mention of the gap between when we last contacted you and the current time. There is no mention of the circumstances in which we parted company as the formal relationship. There is no mention of you knowing what we are, whether you told us, whether you exposed our abuses to others. These are generally not factors which concern us, unless what you happen to do amounted to criticism. The wounding nature of criticism means that a lesser or mid-range narcissist will think carefully before trying to Hoover you. It concerns a greater less. The lesser, and especially the mid-ranger, is once bitten, twice shy. The existence of a new partner is not relevant either in isolation, but as a partial consideration in terms of whether that person might stop us. The lesser and mid-range may well be put off by the fact that you have a new partner. The greater will not. The greater narcissist instead will see it as a challenge and will see the opportunity to obtain fuel from you and also from your new partner through the application of further manipulation. Accordingly, when you are asking yourself whether Hoover may happen, remember this. 1. You can never say never. 2. There needs to be a Hoover trigger. You can significantly influence whether there is such a trigger and reduce the risk, but you cannot remove it entirely because of the 6th sphere of influence. Thirdly, the Hoover execution criteria must be met. Again, you can significantly influence whether the criteria is met by becoming a free and reduce the risk, but you cannot remove it. The issue of whether you will experience a Hoover is not completely in your hands, but is far more within your control than you might at first have thought. It is never the end, but you are not helpless.